The Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the ancient oaks surrounding the Fenridge estate, their tendrils swaying in the humid Georgia air of 1847. The mansion itself stood like a monument to decay, its once white columns now stained with decades of neglect and something darker that seemed to seep from the very foundations. Elias Fenridge had not always been a broken man. Once his voice had thundered from the pulpit of Savannah's First Baptist Church, drawing crowds who hung on his every word about salvation and damnation. But that was before the visions began, before the night he claimed to see angels weeping blood in his bedroom, before he was found naked in the church cemetery, speaking in tongues to graves that had been disturbed. The scandal had been swift and merciless. Whispers of madness, of unholy practices, of a preacher who had lost his way so completely that even God had turned his face away. Elias had fled with his young wife, Margaret, and their 3 children to this remote plantation house, purchased with what remained of his savings and a desperation that bordered on the supernatural. "Papa, why can't we go outside?" 7-year-old Sarah asked on their first morning in the house, her small hands pressed against the parlor window. Beyond the glass, the garden stretched wild and overgrown, filled with the promise of adventure that only a child could see in such desolation. Elias's weathered face hardened as he approached his daughter, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the warped wooden floors. "Because, child, there are things in these woods that hunger for innocence, things that would steal your very soul if given the chance." Margaret looked up from her needlework, concern creasing her brow. "Elias, surely you don't mean to keep them prisoners in their own home?" His eyes, once warm with the fire of righteous conviction, now burned with something far more dangerous. "The Lord has shown me visions, Margaret, creatures that walk between the shadows, ancient things that predate even the Cherokee, who once called this land sacred. They watch, they wait, and they hunger for the pure of heart." 10-year-old Thomas, the eldest, stepped forward with the boldness that would later prove his undoing. "But Papa, how do you know these things are real? Maybe they're just stories the previous owners told to keep people away." The backhand came swift and sharp, sending Thomas stumbling backward. "Do not question what the Almighty has revealed to me, boy. I have seen them with my own eyes. Pale things that move like mist through the trees, their eyes like burning coals in the darkness." Little James, barely 5, began to cry at the violence, and Margaret quickly gathered him into her arms. "Elias, please, they're just children. Children who must be protected," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouts. "I have made a covenant with the forces that dwell here. As long as my blood remains within these walls, they will not cross the threshold. But should even one of my children step beyond that door—" He gestured toward the heavy oak entrance, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the lamplight. "The compact will be broken, and we will all pay the price." That first night, as the family huddled together in the main parlor, the sounds began, scratching at the windows like fingernails on glass, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And somewhere in the distance, a sound that might have been laughter or might have been screaming. It was impossible to tell which. Margaret pulled her children closer, her heart racing as she watched her husband stand vigil by the window, his lips moving in silent prayer. Outside, shapes seemed to move between the trees, too fluid to be human, too purposeful to be mere shadows. "What have you brought us to, Elias?" she whispered, but her husband did not answer. His attention was fixed on something beyond the glass, something that made his face go pale and his hands tremble. In the morning, they would find the first signs, scratches in the earth around the house, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Dead birds arranged in perfect circles and carved into the bark of the great oak nearest the front door, symbols that matched those on the entrance, as if something had been marking its territory. The children pressed their faces to the windows, watching the world beyond with growing desperation. They did not yet understand that their father's madness was not entirely unfounded, or that the price of their protection would prove far higher than any of them could imagine. As the days turned to weeks, the isolation began to take its toll. The children grew pale and listless, their laughter becoming rare and precious. Margaret found herself jumping at shadows, her nerves frayed by the constant vigilance her husband demanded, and in the darkness between sleep and waking, she began to hear them too, the whispers that called her name, promising freedom if only she would open the door and let the children run free in the moonlight. 3 months had passed since the Fenridge family's arrival at the plantation, and the house had become a prison of shadows and silence. Margaret watched her children with growing alarm as they grew thinner and more withdrawn with each passing day. Their skin had taken on a sickly pallor, and dark circles ringed their eyes like bruises. "Mama, I had the dream again," Sarah whispered one morning, climbing into her mother's bed before dawn. "The lady in white was calling to me from the garden. She said if I came outside, she would show me where the flowers sing." Margaret's blood ran cold. This was the 3rd time this week that Sarah had mentioned the woman in white. Thomas had begun speaking of a man who stood at the edge of the woods, beckoning with skeletal fingers, and little James claimed to see children playing in the overgrown maze, children who looked just like him. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. She had seen things too, glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, faces that appeared in the windows for just a moment before vanishing. But unlike her husband, she was beginning to suspect that the true danger lay not outside the house, but within it. Elias had grown increasingly erratic. He spent his days pacing the halls, muttering prayers and checking the locks on every door and window. He had nailed boards over several of the windows on the ground floor, claiming that they were trying to look in. The house grew darker and more oppressive with each passing day. "The children need fresh air and sunlight," Margaret pleaded with her husband one evening as they sat in the parlor. "Look at them, Elias. They're wasting away." Elias barely glanced up from the leather-bound journal he'd been writing in obsessively. The pages were filled with his cramped handwriting, documenting every sound, every shadow, every sign of the supernatural presence he claimed surrounded them. "Better they waste away than lose their souls," he muttered. "I've seen what happens to children who venture into those woods. The Cherokee spoke of it before they were driven out. Children who disappeared and returned, changed, empty vessels for ancient hungers." "You're losing your mind," Margaret said, her patience finally snapping. "There are no demons in those woods, Elias. The only evil in this house is what you're doing to our children." His head snapped up, and for a moment, Margaret saw something in his eyes that made her step backward. It wasn't madness. It was something far worse. It was certainty. "You think I'm mad?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Then explain this." He opened his journal to a page covered with sketches, crude drawings of figures that seemed to writhe on the paper, even in the lamplight. Some appeared human but wrong, with too many joints or faces that were blank except for gaping mouths. Others were barely recognizable as having once been human at all. "I've been documenting them," he said. "Every night they gather closer. Every night they grow bolder. And every night they whisper the names of our children." Margaret stared at the drawings, her heart pounding. Despite herself, she recognized some of the figures. The woman in white that Sarah described. The skeletal man from Thomas's nightmares, and others, so many others, that seemed to watch from every shadow. "Even if what you say is true," she said carefully, "keeping the children locked away like this is killing them slowly. Look at James. He barely speaks anymore, and Sarah, she's starting to talk to people who aren't there." "Better that than what?" Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Than letting them live? Than giving them a chance at happiness? You're so afraid of losing them to whatever's out there that you're destroying them yourself." That night, Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. She waited until Elias had fallen into his fitful sleep, then crept to the children's rooms. She found them all awake, as they so often were these days, staring out their windows at the moonlit grounds. "Children," she whispered, "would you like to go outside, just for a little while?" The transformation in their faces was immediate and heartbreaking. Color returned to their cheeks and their eyes lit up with a joy she hadn't seen in months. "Really, Mama?" Thomas asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Just to the garden," she said. "We'll stay close to the house, and we'll be very quiet so we don't wake Papa." She led them downstairs, her heart hammering as she approached the front door. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to pulse in the moonlight, and for a moment she hesitated, but then she looked at her children, at their eager faces and their desperate hope, and she turned the heavy iron key. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the night. Cool air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Margaret's stomach turn. "Come on," she whispered, taking James's hand and leading her children into the night. The garden was beautiful in the moonlight, more beautiful than it had any right to be. The overgrown roses seemed to glow with an inner light, and the Spanish moss swayed in patterns that were almost hypnotic. The children ran ahead, laughing for the first time in months, and Margaret felt a surge of relief. Perhaps Elias was wrong. Perhaps there was nothing to fear after all. But as she watched her children play among the flowers, she began to notice that they weren't alone. Other children seemed to be playing with them. Pale figures that flickered in and out of sight, like candle flames in the wind. And standing at the edge of the garden, barely visible among the trees, was a woman in white who smiled with too many teeth. Margaret tried to call out, tried to warn her children, but her voice caught in her throat. The woman in white raised one finger to her lips in a gesture of silence, and Margaret found herself unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but watch as her children played with the dead. When she finally found her voice, it was too late. The children were gone, vanished into the maze of overgrown hedges as if they had never been there at all. Only their laughter remained, echoing through the night like the memory of joy. Margaret ran through the garden, calling their names, but found only empty pathways and shadows that seemed to mock her desperation. When she finally returned to the house, she found Elias standing in the doorway, his face a mask of terrible understanding. "You let them out," he said, and his voice was hollow with grief. "I had to," she sobbed. "They were dying in there." "Now they're something worse than dead," he said, and closed the door behind her with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. For 3 days and 3 nights, Margaret and Elias searched the grounds around their home, calling out for their children until their voices were raw and broken. The local sheriff, a weathered man named Coleman who had known better days, organized search parties that combed through the surrounding woods and swampland. But as the hours turned to days, hope began to fade like morning mist. On the 4th morning, Margaret sat by the parlor window, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She had not slept since the children disappeared, sustained only by coffee and the desperate belief that they would return. Elias paced behind her, his journal clutched in his hands, muttering prayers that sounded more like curses. "They're not coming back," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you what would happen. I warned you, but you wouldn't listen." Margaret turned to face her husband, and he was shocked by the transformation in her appearance. In just 3 days, she seemed to have aged years. Her hair, once lustrous and brown, now showed streaks of premature gray, and her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that reminded him uncomfortably of a corpse. "Don't you dare blame me," she said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You're the one who brought us to this godforsaken place. You're the one who filled their heads with stories of monsters and demons. If you hadn't kept them locked up like animals..." "If I hadn't kept them safe, you mean..." Elias interrupted. I made a bargain, Margaret. I thought you understood that. As long as they stayed within these walls, the things in the woods would leave us be. But you broke that compact. You opened the door and let them out. And now... He trailed off as a sound reached them from outside. The sound of children laughing. Margaret's head snapped toward the window, her heart leaping with desperate hope. "Sarah!" she called out, pressing her face to the glass. "Thomas? James?" The laughter came again, closer this time, and Margaret could see movement in the garden. 3 small figures were playing among the overgrown roses, their movements quick and playful. Without thinking, she ran toward the front door. "Margaret, no!" Elias grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Look at them, really look." She turned back to the window, and this time she saw what he meant. The children in the garden moved wrong. Too fluid, too quick, like marionettes controlled by an inexpert hand. And their skin was the color of moonlight, pale and translucent, as if all the blood had been drained from their bodies. "That's not them," Elias whispered. "That's what's wearing their faces." But Margaret was beyond reason. She tore free from her husband's grasp and flung open the front door. "Sarah, Thomas, James, come inside, my darlings, come home." The 3 figures in the garden stopped their play and turned toward the house. Even from a distance, Margaret could see that their eyes were wrong, too large, too dark, like pools of black water that reflected nothing. But their faces were her children's faces, and that was enough. "Mama!" called the thing that looked like Sarah, its voice carrying perfectly across the garden despite the distance. "We've been playing with our new friends. They've taught us such wonderful games." "Come inside," Margaret called back, tears streaming down her face. "Come home and we'll have supper. I'll make your favorite, apple pie with cinnamon." The thing that looked like Thomas tilted its head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "We don't eat food anymore, Mama. We eat other things now, sweeter things." Elias appeared beside Margaret in the doorway, his face pale with terror. "Don't invite them in," he hissed. "Whatever you do, don't invite them across the threshold." But it was too late. The 3 figures had begun walking toward the house, their movements becoming more natural with each step, as if they were remembering how to be human. By the time they reached the front porch, they looked almost exactly like the children who had disappeared 3 days ago. "Hello, Papa," said the thing wearing James's face. Its voice was perfect, exactly the right pitch and tone, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "We missed you." Margaret knelt down and opened her arms, and the 3 figures walked into her embrace. They felt real enough, solid and warm, but there was something wrong with their heartbeats. They were too slow, too irregular, like the rhythm of a clock that was winding down. "Where have you been?" she sobbed, holding them close. "We've been so worried. We searched everywhere." "We've been learning," said the Sarah thing, its voice muffled against Margaret's shoulder. "The lady in white has been teaching us about the old ways, about the hunger that lives in the dark places." Elias backed away from the reunion, his journal clutched to his chest like a shield. He could see what Margaret could not, or perhaps would not. The children's shadows fell wrong, stretching in directions that defied the position of the sun. And their reflections in the window glass showed not the faces of children, but something else entirely, something with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. "Margaret," he said urgently, "bring them inside, quickly." She led the children into the parlor, settling them on the sofa where they sat with unnatural stillness. They didn't fidget or squirm as children should. They simply sat and watched their parents with those 2 dark eyes. "Are you hungry?" Margaret asked, her maternal instincts overriding her growing unease. "Thirsty? You must be tired after being away so long." "We're not tired, Mama," said the Thomas thing. "We don't sleep anymore. Sleep is for the living." The words hung in the air like a death knell, and Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" The lady in white explained everything. said the James thing, its small hands folded neatly in its lap. She told us about the compact Papa made, how he promised to keep us inside so that we would stay pure and untainted, how our innocence was the price of his protection. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. How do you know about that? The three children turned to look at him in perfect unison, their movements synchronized like a music box ballet. Because we're part of it now, Papa. We're part of the bargain, and the terms have changed. What do you mean? Margaret asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. The Sarah thing smiled, and for just a moment, its face seemed to flicker, revealing something underneath that was all teeth and hunger. We can come and go as we please now, but you have to stay, forever and always. You have to stay within these walls. Because if you leave, if you break the new compact, then we'll have to feed on others, and we're so very, very hungry. Outside, the sun was setting, and the shadows in the parlor grew long and dark. Margaret looked at her children, at the things that wore their faces, and realized with growing horror that they cast no shadows at all. What happened to my real children? She whispered. The three figures exchanged glances, and when they smiled, their teeth seemed sharper than they should be. We are your real children, Mama, they said in unison, their voices harmonizing in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. We're just improved. 6 months had passed since the children's return, and the Fenridge house had become a monument to madness and despair. Margaret had aged decades in those months, her hair now completely white and her hands shaking with a palsy that no doctor could explain. She rarely spoke anymore, spending her days sitting by the window, watching her children play in the garden with their invisible friends. The children themselves had grown stranger with each passing week. They no longer ate food, claiming they were sustained by other means. They never slept, instead spending their nights wandering the halls and whispering to the shadows. And their games had become increasingly disturbing. Elias found Margaret in the parlor one grey November morning, staring out at the garden where the children were playing what looked like a normal game of tag. But as he watched, he noticed that their playmates were becoming more visible, pale, translucent figures that flickered in and out of sight like heat mirages. How many are there now? He asked, settling into the chair beside his wife. Dozens, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Maybe hundreds. They come from the woods every night, drawn by whatever our children have become. Elias opened his journal to a fresh page and began sketching the scene before them. His drawings had become more detailed over the months, more accurate, as if proximity to the supernatural had sharpened his perception of it. The figures he drew now were clearly recognizable as the spirits of children, some wearing clothes from decades past, others from even earlier eras. I've been researching the history of this land, he said, not looking up from his drawing. The Cherokee called this place the Hungry Ground. They said it was where the spirits of children who died before their time would gather, waiting for someone to join their eternal games. Margaret turned to look at her husband, and he was shocked by the emptiness in her eyes. Are you saying our children are dead? I'm saying there's something else now, Elias replied carefully. Something that wears their faces and speaks with their voices, but isn't them, not anymore. As if summoned by their conversation, the three children came running into the house, their cheeks flushed with what looked like exertion, but felt wrong somehow. They moved with too much energy, too much vitality, as if they were drawing life from somewhere else. Mama! Papa! Called the Sarah thing, its voice bright with artificial cheer. We've made so many new friends. They've been telling us stories about the old days, about all the families who lived here before us. What kind of stories? Elias asked, though he dreaded the answer. The Thomas thing perched on the arm of Margaret's chair, its weight somehow both real and insubstantial. Stories about children who got lost in the woods and never found their way home, about parents who went looking for them and disappeared too, about a house that keeps its secrets buried deep in the cellar. Margaret's head snapped up at that. What cellar? This house doesn't have a cellar." The three children exchanged those synchronized glances again, and the James thing giggled, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but it does, Mama. It's just been hidden for a very long time. Would you like us to show you?" Before either parent could respond, the children had taken their hands and were leading them toward the back of the house, to a part of the mansion that had been sealed off since their arrival. The Sarah thing produced an old iron key from somewhere in the folds of its dress, a key that Elias was certain hadn't existed moments before. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "The lady in white gave it to us," the Thomas thing replied matter-of-factly. "She said it was time for you to see the truth about this place, about what you really agreed to when you made your bargain." The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Margaret gag. "We don't want to go down there," she said, trying to pull back, but the children's grips were surprisingly strong. "But you have to," the James thing said, its voice taking on a petulant tone. "It's part of the compact. You have to see what you're protecting us from, what we're protecting you from." The descent into the cellar felt like a journey into hell itself. The walls were carved from living rock, and strange symbols covered every surface, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light of the candles the children had somehow produced. The air grew colder with each step, and Margaret could hear sounds echoing from the depths below, whispers, laughter, and something that might have been weeping. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a vast underground chamber that stretched far beyond what should have been possible given the dimensions of the house above. The walls were lined with alcoves, and in each alcove, Margaret screamed. In each alcove sat the mummified remains of a child, their bodies preserved by the strange atmosphere of the cellar. Some wore clothes from the current century, others from decades or even centuries past. But all of them had one thing in common. Their eyes had been replaced with smooth black stones, and their mouths were sewn shut with silver thread. "Welcome to the real Fenridge family," the Sarah thing said, its voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "Every child who has ever lived in the house above, every innocent soul who was offered up to keep the hungry things at bay." Elias stared in horror at the dozens of preserved corpses. "This is what you meant by a compact. This is what I agreed to." "Not exactly," said a new voice, and they turned to see a woman in white emerging from the shadows at the far end of the chamber. She was beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers are beautiful, lovely to look at but deadly to touch. "The compact your predecessor made was much simpler. He agreed to provide one child every generation to feed the hunger of this place. In return, his family would be protected from the other things that dwell in these woods." "But I never agreed to that," Elias protested. "I never." "You agreed to keep your children safe within these walls," the woman interrupted. "You agreed to let them waste away, rather than risk their souls to the dangers outside. What did you think would happen when they finally died of neglect and despair? Did you think their spirits would simply move on to whatever lies beyond?" Margaret looked around the chamber with growing understanding and horror. "You're saying that every family who lived here, they all sacrificed their children?" "Not sacrificed," the woman corrected. "Preserved. Kept safe from the true horrors that lurk in the darkness between worlds. Your children are safe now, Mrs. Fenridge. They will never grow old, never suffer, never die. They will play here forever in the company of all the other children who came before them. But they're not really our children anymore," Margaret whispered. "No," the woman agreed. "They're something much better. They're eternal." The three children who wore her children's faces smiled up at Margaret with those two dark eyes. "Don't you want to stay with us, Mama? Don't you want to be part of the family forever?" Margaret looked at her husband, at the woman in white, at the dozens of preserved corpses lining the walls, and then she looked at the things that had once been her children, and she made a choice that would echo through the halls of the Fenridge house for generations to come. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I do." The transformation began that very night. Margaret felt it first as a coldness that started in her chest and spread outward like frost, forming on a window. She sat in her bedroom, brushing her white hair and watching her reflection in the mirror as it slowly began to change. Her skin grew paler, more translucent, and her eyes darkened until they matched those of her children. Elias found her there the next morning, sitting perfectly still before the mirror, her brush fallen from lifeless fingers. But when he approached, she turned to him with a smile that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. "Good morning, my love," she said, her voice carrying that same hollow quality that had infected their children's speech. "Isn't it wonderful? I can see them all now. Every child who has ever lived in this house. They're all here waiting for us to join their games." Elias backed away from his wife, his journal clutched to his chest. "Margaret, what have you done?" "I've accepted the truth," she replied, rising from her chair with movements that were too fluid, too graceful for a human body. "This house isn't a prison, Elias. It's a sanctuary, a place where families can be together forever, where children never have to grow up and face the cruelties of the world." "You're not Margaret," he whispered. "You're something else wearing her face." She tilted her head at that impossible angle, just as the children did. "I'm more Margaret than I ever was before. I'm Margaret without fear, without doubt, without the burden of mortality. And soon you'll join us too." But Elias was not ready to surrender. That night, while his transformed family played their eternal games in the garden, he barricaded himself in his study and began to write. If he could not save his family, perhaps he could at least warn others who might come after. He wrote of the compact that bound the house, of the woman in white who collected children's souls, like a gardener collecting flowers. He wrote of the cellar full of preserved corpses, and the spirits that danced in the moonlight. And he wrote of the choice that every family who lived here would eventually face: join the eternal games, or watch their loved ones waste away into something far worse than death. For 3 days, he wrote without stopping, sustained only by coffee and the desperate hope that someone, someday, would read his words and understand. But on the 4th day, they came for him. He heard them first as whispers in the walls, then as footsteps in the hallway outside his study. The door, which he had locked and barricaded, swung open as if it weighed nothing at all. Margaret stood in the doorway, flanked by their 3 children, all of them smiling with that same terrible serenity. "It's time, Elias," Margaret said, extending her hand toward him. "Time to join the family properly." "I won't," he said, backing against the window. "I won't become like you. You already are," said the Seraphim, its voice gentle and patient. "You've been changing since the day we returned. Haven't you noticed? You don't eat anymore, you don't sleep. You spend your days writing in that journal. But when was the last time you actually read what you've written?" Elias looked down at his journal, at the pages he had filled with his desperate warnings. But the words on the page weren't what he remembered writing. Instead, they were filled with drawings, hundreds of sketches of children playing, of families gathered together, of a house where love conquered death itself. "You see," Margaret said, moving closer, "you've been one of us all along. You just needed time to accept it." Elias felt the last of his resistance crumble as he looked at his family. His beautiful, eternal family who would never age, never suffer, never leave him. The woman in white appeared beside them, her smile warm and welcoming. "Welcome home, Elias," she said. "Welcome to the real Fenridge family." And so the cycle continued, as it had for generations before and would for generations to come. The house stood empty for decades after that, its windows boarded up and its grounds overgrown. But sometimes, on moonlit nights, travelers passing by would report seeing lights in the windows and hearing the sound of children laughing in the garden. In 1923, The property was finally sold to a young couple from Atlanta, the Hendersons, who had 3 children of their own and dreams of restoring the old mansion to its former glory. They found Elias's journal in the study, along with dozens of others left by previous families, but they dismissed the writings as the ravings of madmen, the products of isolation and superstition. The Henderson children were never allowed outside either, though for different reasons than the Fenridge children had been. Mrs. Henderson claimed they were too delicate for the Georgia heat, too sensitive for the rough play of country children. She kept them inside, safe and protected, just as every mother before her had done. And in the cellar, the collection grew larger. The woman in white was patient. She had all the time in the world, and there were always more families, more children, more souls to add to her eternal garden. The Fenridge family had been particularly special. Their love for each other had been so strong that they had chosen transformation over separation. But every family brought something unique to the collection, some new flavor of devotion and despair. On quiet nights, when the moon was dark and the world above was sleeping, all the families would gather in the great parlor that existed somewhere between the house and the cellar, somewhere between life and death. The Fenridges would be there, still playing their games, still loving each other with an intensity that transcended mortality. And they would welcome each new family with open arms, teaching them the rules of their eternal existence. The children never aged, the parents never died, and the house kept its secrets, buried deep in the earth where only the dead could find them. But sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind was right and the barriers between worlds grew thin, the truth would seep up through the floorboards like groundwater. And those who were sensitive to such things would feel it, the weight of all those watching eyes, the echo of all that laughter, the terrible love that bound the Fenridge family together for all eternity. The house still stands today, though it has changed hands many times since the Hendersons. Each family brings their own story, their own tragedy, their own choice between love and loss. And in the cellar, the alcoves wait patiently for new occupants, while the woman in white tends her garden of souls with the devotion of a mother caring for her children, because that's what she is in the end, a mother who refuses to let her children go, who has found a way to keep them safe forever in a world that exists outside of time and death. And every family who comes to live in her house eventually understands the terrible beauty of that gift, the awful mercy of eternal love. The Fenridge family was never allowed outside because outside meant change, meant growth, meant the possibility of loss. Inside, they could remain perfect forever, a family frozen in amber, preserved in the moment before everything falls apart. And in the end, isn't that what every parent wants? To keep their children safe, no matter the cost? The house remembers everything, every laugh, every tear, every whispered prayer in the darkness. It remembers the Fenridges, who chose love over freedom, and the Hendersons, who followed in their footsteps with the same tragic devotion. It remembers the Blackwoods, who came after, and the Ashfords, who came after them, each family adding their own chapter to the endless story of the hungry ground. In the modern era, when the property was finally abandoned by the state and left to decay, urban explorers and paranormal investigators would sometimes venture onto the grounds. They came with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Most left disappointed, finding nothing but an empty house and overgrown gardens. But a few, those who stayed past midnight, those who ventured into the cellar, those who opened their hearts to the possibility of something beyond death, they found the Fenridge family waiting for them, not as ghosts or spirits, but as something far more substantial. As a family that had transcended the boundaries between life and death, between love and obsession. The woman in white still tends her garden, though the roses have long since grown wild and the Spanish moss hangs heavier than ever from the ancient oaks. She moves through the grounds like a memory-made manifest, checking on her charges, ensuring that the compact remains unbroken. Sometimes she appears to visitors as a helpful guide, offering to show them the real history of the house. Other times, she simply watches from the shadows, waiting to see if they have children of their own. The cellar has expanded over the years, growing deeper and wider as more families join the eternal collection. The alcoves now number in the hundreds, each one containing the preserved remains of a child who chose eternity over uncertainty. And in the center of it all, in a place of honor, sit the original Fenridge children, Sarah, Thomas, and James, their bodies perfectly preserved, their spirits free to roam the house above. Elias still writes in his journal, though the words change depending on who reads them. To some, they appear as warnings about the dangers of the house. To others, they read as love letters to his family, expressions of gratitude for the gift of eternal togetherness. The truth, as always, depends on what the reader needs to see. Margaret tends to the newer families, helping them adjust to their transformed existence. She has become something of a mother figure to the other women who have made the same choice she did, teaching them how to love without fear, how to protect without smothering, how to keep their children safe in a world that exists outside the normal flow of time. And the children, all the children from every era, from every family, they play together in the gardens and halls of the house, their laughter echoing through dimensions that most humans cannot perceive. They are innocent and eternal, protected from the harsh realities of growing up, of growing old, of growing apart. The house itself has become something more than wood and stone. It is a living repository of love and loss, a place where the boundaries between devotion and madness have been erased entirely. It feeds on the emotions of the families who live within its walls, growing stronger with each generation, each choice, each soul that decides to stay rather than leave. Local historians have tried to piece together the true history of the Fenridge estate, but the records are incomplete, contradictory, impossible to verify. Some claim the house was built on an ancient Cherokee burial ground. Others insist it was the site of a colonial-era orphanage that burned down under mysterious circumstances. The truth is probably simpler and more terrible than any of these theories. It is simply a place where love became so concentrated, so intense, that it warped the very fabric of reality around it. The woman in white knows the real history, of course. She remembers when the first family arrived, desperate and broken, willing to make any bargain to keep their children safe. She remembers the moment when love became something darker, when protection became imprisonment, when the desire to keep loved ones close forever overcame all other considerations. She was that first mother, though her name has been lost to time and transformation. She made the original compact with forces that existed long before human civilization, entities that fed on emotion and thrived in the spaces between life and death. In exchange for her children's eternal safety, she agreed to serve as their guardian and recruiter, drawing other families into the same terrible bargain. Over the centuries, she has perfected her methods. She knows exactly what to say to desperate parents, how to present the choice in terms that make it seem reasonable, even merciful. She understands that every parent harbors the secret fear that they will not be able to protect their children from the world's cruelties, and she offers them a solution that is both beautiful and monstrous. The Fenridge family was special because they embraced the transformation so completely. Most families resist at first, clinging to their humanity even as it slips away. But the Fenridges understood instinctively that love sometimes requires sacrifice. that keeping someone safe might mean changing them into something else entirely. Their story has become legend among the spirits that inhabit the house. They are held up as an example of what a family can become when they choose each other over everything else, over life, over death, over the natural order itself. They are proof that love can conquer anything, even mortality, if the price is paid willingly. And so the house waits, patient and eternal, for the next family to discover its secrets. It waits for parents who love their children too much to let them go, for children who would rather stay safe than grow up, for souls who are willing to trade freedom for the promise of forever. The Fenridge family is still there, still playing their games, still loving each other with an intensity that burns like a cold flame in the darkness. They are the heart of the house now, the center around which all the other stories revolve. Their love has become the foundation upon which the entire supernatural ecosystem rests. And sometimes, on nights when the veil between worlds grows thin, their story bleeds through into the waking world. People driving past the abandoned estate report, seeing lights in the windows, hearing children's laughter carried on the wind. Some claim to have seen a family of 5 standing on the front porch, waving as if welcoming visitors home. These sightings are dismissed as tricks of light and shadow, as the products of overactive imaginations. But those who have studied the history of the house know better. They know that the Fenridge family is still there, still together, still bound by a love that has transcended every natural law. They are waiting, as they have always waited, for others to join them in their eternal game. Because in the end, that's all any of them ever wanted, to play together, to love each other, to never have to say goodbye. The house remembers, the woman in white remembers. And somewhere in the space between memory and reality, between love and madness, the Fenridge family continues their horrific history, adding new chapters with each soul that chooses to stay. The children were never allowed outside because outside meant ending. Inside they could continue forever, playing their games in a garden where the roses never die and the Spanish moss sways to music only they can hear. And perhaps in the end, that is enough. The legacy of the Fenridge family extends far beyond the boundaries of their Georgian estate. In the decades following their transformation, whispers of their story spread through the underground networks of those who study the supernatural, occultists, paranormal researchers, and families who had experienced similar phenomena in other locations. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a professor of folklore at Emory University, spent the better part of the 1970s documenting what she called familial preservation sites, locations where intense parental love had somehow transcended death itself. Her research, published posthumously after her mysterious disappearance in 1979, identified 17 such sites across the American South, each with its own variation of the Fenridge pattern. In her final notes, found scattered across her office desk, Dr. Marsh wrote, "The Fenridge case represents the purest expression of what I have come to call protective metamorphosis, the transformation of human love into something that exists outside the normal parameters of life and death. The family unit becomes a closed system, feeding on its own emotional energy and growing stronger with each generation that chooses preservation over progression." Her research suggested that the woman in white was not unique to the Fenridge estate, but rather part of a larger network of entities that had learned to cultivate and harvest familial devotion. These beings, which Dr. Marsh termed maternal shepherds, appeared to move between sites, establishing new preservation grounds wherever they found families desperate enough to make the necessary sacrifices. The pattern was always the same: isolation, desperation, the gradual erosion of boundaries between protection and imprisonment, and finally the choice between losing loved ones to the natural world or keeping them forever in an unnatural one. The Fenridge family had simply been the most successful example of this process, their love so pure and complete that they had become a template for all who followed. In 1983, a young journalist named Michael Torres attempted to investigate the Fenridge estate for a magazine article about Southern Gothic legends. He spent 3 days on the property, camping in the overgrown gardens and exploring the abandoned house. His final journal entry, discovered weeks later when search teams found his abandoned campsite, read, "Day 3. I understand now why families stay. It's not about fear or madness or supernatural compulsion. It's about love in its most concentrated form. I've seen them, the Fenridges, and they're not ghosts or demons or anything evil. They're just a family that loved each other so much they refused to let death separate them. Margaret showed me the cellar tonight, and I saw all the children, all the families who made the same choice. They're not suffering, they're not trapped. They're exactly where they want to be, playing eternal games in a place where nothing bad can ever happen to them again." Torres was never found, though locals reported seeing a young man playing with the Fenridge children in the garden on moonlit nights. His camera equipment was discovered in the cellar, along with hundreds of photographs that showed empty rooms and corridors, except for one. A single image captured the entire Fenridge family standing together in the parlor, smiling at the camera with expressions of perfect contentment. The photograph was studied by experts who declared it authentic, though they could not explain how it had been taken or why the figures in it seemed to move slightly when viewed from different angles. It was eventually donated to the Savannah Historical Society, where it remains on display in a climate-controlled case, drawing visitors who come to stare into the faces of a family that chose eternity over uncertainty. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Fenridge estate became something of a pilgrimage site for those who had lost children or feared losing them. Parents who had watched their children grow up and move away, who felt the natural separation that comes with maturity as a kind of death, would sometimes find their way to the abandoned house. Most left disappointed, finding only ruins and overgrowth. But a few, those who truly understood the price and were willing to pay it, found exactly what they were looking for. The woman in white adapted to the changing times, learning to present her offer in terms that modern families could understand. She spoke of quality time, of family bonds, of creating safe spaces where children could remain innocent forever. She understood that contemporary parents faced different fears than their predecessors, not just physical dangers, but psychological ones, social pressures, the corruption of innocence by an increasingly complex world. To these modern families, she offered the same bargain that had been made centuries before, dressed in the language of their time. She promised a place where children would never be exposed to violence or hatred, where families could remain close without the interference of outside influences, where love could flourish without the constraints of mortality or the inevitable changes that time brings to all relationships. The house itself evolved as well, its supernatural architecture expanding to accommodate the needs of each new era. Rooms appeared and disappeared as needed, their contents shifting to match the expectations and desires of their inhabitants. A family from the 1950s might find themselves in a perfect suburban home, complete with modern appliances and comfortable furnishings. A family from the 1990s might discover a house equipped with all the latest technology, frozen at the moment of their arrival and maintained in perpetual perfection. But beneath these surface changes, the fundamental nature of the place remained constant. It was still a sanctuary for those who loved too much to let go, a refuge for families who chose preservation over progress. The cellar still housed its growing collection of preserved children, each one a testament to a parent's desperate love. And the Fenridge family still served as the heart of it all, their story inspiring and guiding each new generation of eternal families. In the early 2000s, the property was briefly investigated by a team of paranormal researchers equipped with the latest digital recording equipment. Their footage, later leaked online despite legal efforts to suppress it, showed what appeared to be a fully inhabited house where the official records indicated only ruins should exist. The researchers captured hours of audio featuring children's laughter, adult conversations, and what sounded like family dinners, complete with the clinking of silverware and the murmur of pleasant conversation. Most disturbing of all was a segment of video that showed the lead researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, having what appeared to be a normal conversation with empty air. The audio clearly captured both sides of the dialogue, with Dr. Chen asking questions about the history of the house and receiving detailed answers in the voice of a woman who identified herself as Margaret Fenridge. When Dr. Chen's colleagues reviewed the footage later, they could see only their colleagues speaking to shadows, though the audio track contained clear evidence of a second participant in the conversation. Dr. Chen's final report, submitted to her university before her resignation from academic life, concluded, "The Fenridge estate exists in a state of temporal and dimensional flux, occupying multiple realities simultaneously. The family that bears its name has achieved a form of existence that transcends our normal understanding of life and death. They are not ghosts in any traditional sense, but rather beings who have evolved beyond the constraints of linear time and physical mortality. Their love for each other has become a force of nature, creating a pocket of reality where their desires and needs take precedence over the laws of physics and biology." Dr. Chen was last seen driving toward the Fenridge estate with her own 2 young children in the backseat of her car. Her vehicle was found abandoned at the property's entrance, but no trace of the family was ever discovered. Local authorities conducted extensive searches of the grounds and surrounding woods, but found only the usual signs of long abandonment, overgrown gardens, boarded windows, and the persistent smell of decay that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Yet, those who knew how to look, who understood the true nature of the place, could see the signs of new inhabitants. Fresh flowers appeared in the garden despite the lack of care. Lights flickered in windows that had been dark for decades. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was still, the sound of children playing could be heard drifting across the grounds. Not the voices of the original Fenridge children, but new voices, younger voices, the voices of a family that had made the same choice that so many had made before them. The cycle continued, as it always had and always would. The house waited patiently for each new family, each new opportunity to demonstrate the transformative power of love, pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The woman in white continued her eternal vigil, tending to her ever-growing collection of preserved souls with the devotion of a gardener caring for prize roses. And somewhere in the space between reality and dream, between love and obsession, the Fenridge family played on, their laughter echoing through dimensions that most humans could never perceive. They had become more than a family. They had become a symbol, a promise, a terrible and beautiful example of what could be achieved when love refused to accept the limitations of mortality. Their story had no ending because they had chosen to exist outside the normal flow of narrative time. They were eternal, unchanging, perfect in their preservation of a single moment of familial bliss stretched across centuries. They were the horrific history that the house remembered, the dark foundation upon which all subsequent stories were built. And they were waiting, as they had always waited, for the next family to discover that sometimes the greatest act of love is the willingness to become something monstrous in order to keep those you cherish safe forever. The children were never allowed outside because outside meant change, and change meant the possibility of loss. Inside, they could remain exactly as they were, innocent, beloved and eternal, playing their games in a garden where time had no meaning and love conquered all, even death itself. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was